I'm curious about the intersection. We haven't really talked about that much in our last episode on BESS, but can you walk us through kind of the main steps of the interconnection process for these projects and maybe even share the timeline as you go through those steps?
Yeah. So interconnection is big. There are long timelines these days, which I'll talk a little bit about. And interconnection is exactly that, the process of connecting your project to transmission. It varies by region. There's different ISOs, RTOs that you have to play within different regions of the US, but they all follow the same general process of applying, getting your project in the door. Usually there's a queue or a wait list that you get assigned to. ERCOT's famous for not having a queue position. And ERCOT is in Texas. CAISO, the California ISO, is notorious for their long wait list. Once you're in that queue, you start doing technical screenings and studies. You want to see what the facility is going to look like, how it connects technically, short circuit of the grid. You do a steady state study, look at grid stability, right? All these engineering studies, looking at power flow models. And the details kind of requirements will vary by region there. Once all that's dialed in, you work on an interconnection agreement with the transmission service provider, TSP, or the utility. Um, and then you're locked in. Then it's time to really move forward and build the project. So moving into design, starting procurement. Procurement's another big timeline risk right now because the high voltage transformers and high voltage circuit breakers have long lead times, up to 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. So another reason, along with the interconnection timeline, which I'll touch on shortly, to get ahead of this process. Um, After design, procurement, construction, now you're into commissioning, inspections, getting final sign off from the ISO, and moving into operation and maintenance. So again, the process varies a bit by the different regions, but generally about the same. ERCOT, the Texas ISO, is currently the shortest. I think you can get down to about 3 years. Maybe if you're really lucky and you have those long lead items ahead of time, might be able to get online in 2 years. ISO is probably the California ISO 4, maybe really worst case 7 years. Some of that is due to issues that come up with the project, not necessarily the queue. Um, and for all regions right now, FERC is really pushing for reform. They just came out with a new order in May of 2024 that's really pushing to increase the efficiency of the interconnection process. It's increasing fees and cancellation costs, trying to knock out people who are just sitting in the interconnection queue, maybe not totally ready to build the project, but they're trying to get in line so that they're there when they are ready. So that's really having a big effect on cost and queue timelines. But I think it's going to be the best for the industry going forward.
We've
Yeah,
seen that
anywhere from three
production
to
lag.
5+ years.
We've seen that increase, like, cause a time increase. The recent FERT adjustments is obviously to reduce that timeline and weed out people who don't need to be in the queue. But has that increased your cost? And in what kind of ways do we anticipate that?
Yep. Increased costs, increased cancellation fees. So if you get in the queue and you're sitting there and you're like, oh, hey, we got to pull out. We can't do this. You now have to pay more to pull out. But it looks like it's already clearing up the queues and decreasing timelines. So I think it's a positive effect overall, but you got to really be ready to pay to play.
Sean,
They don't want anyone lollygagging.
how does that compare to Australia, where you guys are doing projects at your company? What is the global comparison to our timelines here?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because Australia can't believe the long lead item timeline. Actually. So that's huge. I think Australia can probably get a project online in about a year.
Wow.
The interconnection process, especially the technical aspects, the power flow models, and the grid requirements are much more stringent. They put a lot more time and money into modeling the grid there. I think the Australian grid's a bit weaker. And because the country is so big and spread out, they really have to be sure that they're not messing up the transmission. Costs vary a lot in the US. Um, so I think on average costs are probably about the same. But yeah, that can change a lot depending on region.
Wow. Yeah, one
Man,
thing
so
I think
interesting.
one thing I think it's important to underline is that energy storage is a very regulatory driven business, meaning
Mhm.
that you have areas of the country, so California and Texas being prime examples, or other parts of the world, Australia, UK, South Korea, where the markets create conditions where energy storage really can shine. But you have other parts of the world or the country where the technology is the same, the grid is very similar, but the markets are designed in ways where energy storage does not get the rewards that are available in some other markets. And that affects everything from the amount of revenues that you have on the project, to that interconnection timeline, to the studies that you have to run. So I think there's a lot of push in the industry, everything from these short orders to state incentives and state marketplaces that should be set up, that a lot of the companies, both developers, manufacturers, and others in the industry, they're pushing to try to push these markets forward, because the tech is there, it can offer these benefits, but only if the markets and the rules allow for it to come online.
Yeah, I think that's as an industry, everybody's pushing toward that, right? I think with the industry and innovation will take us as far as we want it to. We just have to get out of our way. And I think that's we're get out of our own ways from a regulatory standpoint. So I think we'll all see that, and we all hope that we'll continue to see that progression forward and get this to be a much more efficient project. Because to Sean's point, you can get this done in a year. It doesn't have to take 7 or 8. So hopefully we'll start to see some of the parts of the country that are a little more progressive, the ERCOTs, and that at least get it done in 3 years. Maybe start to set the model for other ISOs to follow.
I did want to also point out that most of what we've been talking about so far is focused on projects where you're selling services either to the ISO, RTO, or the utility. But there are a lot of projects that are out there that have what we would call corporate off-taker, meaning that you have an entity that's buying the services that isn't necessarily the utility or the ISO. And a big example of that is something like data centers. We have,
Yes.
obviously a huge growth in that sector. They're massive consumers of power, but sometimes they procure land, and they may have the land, but they may have the ability to connect. But if they want to draw a certain amount of power to run their facility, the utility might say, hey, you got to wait 3 or 4 years or pay however many millions of dollars, things that can become barriers to the project. So another route is to say, we're going to put solar or batteries or a combination of those on site. And that way we won't have to have as big a pipe feeding us power from the utility. And in that case, you may be doing both. You maybe have, let's say a big data center developer, let's say Meta or Google or someone might be buying part of the services you sell, and another part might be going to one of these markets. But that's a real growing sector for revenue stream for battery projects.
We're starting to see some of that data center type land sourcing as well in the land world. So yeah, it's all evolving, and they're going to find ways to leverage this. So we're excited to kind of see where that takes us as well from the land side of things. But it's very much the data center where it's partnered with renewables companies who are doing solar, who are doing battery. So it all has a place for sure. What are we talked about kind of the interconnection lead times, why these projects take so long. That's the 5 or 6 year potential timeline is often why we tend to buy these parcels as opposed to, lease them. Um, so when we do lease, it's long-term lease agreements, but the obvious goal is outright purchase. If you've got land, you've got opportunities to partner with other groups. If you own that land outright, you can partner with other groups, you can sell off, you can have future development. You can expand your operations. So the kind of industry common accepted way of going about land capture from what we see is outright purchase. But as landmen, there are some considerations you need to think there when you maybe are working with your clients on a battery storage project. If you're negotiating for the purchase of land, different states are going to have different laws and regulations about licensing, so landmen typically aren't licensed realtors. So if you're a landman doing that kind of work, you need to be real careful about what you're doing, how you're going about those discussions, and when you maybe hand things over to a realtor on your team or to someone directly in-house who may be negotiating those purchases, because that can monkey up a process early on. That's already a long process, and you don't want to cause any delay there. So